Hello, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reform GGA, this YouTube channel, and today I'm going to be doing a safety video for you folks. The safety video that I have planned will cover the 4 universal rules of gun safety. I will also talk about some of the procedures that I and the people that I regularly go shooting with have when we go to the range, basic range procedures and those kinds of things that further enhance safety. And then if we have time to do it, we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the controls of semi-auto guns. We won't be able to get into a whole lot of detail on that, but hopefully we'll be able to do at least some basics. All right, now for a little bit of background for my regular viewers so that they know why I'm doing this. Most of the time when I go shooting with people, it's relatively boring in the sense that the group of people I go shooting with is relatively static. You know, a few friends here, some family members there, usually a relatively static group. And whenever we go out, we almost always start with a safety briefing of some kind before we actually start shooting, and then after we've had our safety briefing, addressed any concerns, then we get into the shooting. And most of the time that safety briefing doesn't last very long. A lot of times, if it's with people that we know and are relatively familiar with and have been shooting with us for a while, it usually doesn't take more than 5, maybe 10 minutes to kind of refresh ourselves on what the basic safety rules are and address any concerns. It usually doesn't take too terribly long. But sometimes we have people join us who are not really familiar with firearms, sometimes not at all. And of course, we want to give those people a lot more instruction because they're not familiar. Some of them may never have even heard of the 4 universal safety rules. There's quite a gap in knowledge that can occur with someone who is brand new to something, or perhaps did it way back in the day, but it's been a really long time and they haven't dealt with it since. And you want to make sure that you give those people a really solid foundation so that nothing bad happens, because after all, we're dealing with firearms, and one thing that most people are quite aware of with firearms is that firearms can kill if you don't treat them with due respect and treat them in a way that shows respect towards others. We want to make sure that nobody is blindsided. We want to make sure that people feel confident that they're going to be able to do this safely, and they're going to be able to do this in a way that doesn't constitute an undue risk, and nothing that's going to get them in trouble, nothing that's going to result in any unexpected injury or death or anything like that. We want to make sure that we're good and proper about everything and we take it seriously. Shooting as a hobby, as a sport, can be a wonderful recreational activity and very enjoyable, but only if it's safe. And that's where this kind of a briefing would come into play. I'm going to go ahead and give that briefing in video form so that hopefully when we get to the actual range day, we don't have to spend quite as much time there on site talking about these things. Like I said, I still would want to do a basic overview pretty much regardless of who is there or not, whether they're experienced or not. We're always going to do an overview just to make sure that we're all on the same page. But I don't want it to take too terribly much time. I want people to actually be able to get into it and not worry about things too much. And so front-loading that kind of information is often helpful. And so that's why we're here. Now, as to the 4 universal rules of gun safety, there is a mnemonic that I like to use. And this mnemonic, frankly, is kind of corny and it's not very special at all, but it works to help people remember. And that's the whole idea behind a mnemonic. So I'm not claiming that this is great or anything like that. There's probably other people that will come up with way better systems, and that's fine and wonderful, but this is the system that I use. The mnemonic is a very simple sentence, and that sentence is thus: loaded fingers point at backstops. That's a fairly short sentence, kind of a nonsensical one, kind of weird, but that's the mnemonic. Loaded fingers point at backstops. Each part of that sentence is meant to remind you of one of the 4 universal safety rules. So let's just go to the first word in the sentence, loaded. When it comes to firearms, we're always going to treat them as if they're loaded unless we've actually checked and cleared them ourselves. It is not considered rude at all to any extent to be handed a firearm to use at the range, and to go ahead and check it and clear it yourself. Now, we'll get into kind of the operation of firearms a little bit more later on in the video. We're not going to worry about that right now. But that is not considered a rude thing at all to check it for yourself, because that is, after all, the first rule of gun safety, is that you never, ever, ever, ever want to assume something about a firearm. Just because somebody tells you that it's unloaded doesn't mean that it's unloaded. People make mistakes, and those mistakes, unfortunately have cost people their lives in the past. And I don't want to dwell on this too much, because this video, I intend it to be useful for both adults and older kids who are at the point where they can, actually understand what is going on and be capable of that level of responsibility. So I don't want to get into the too macabre when it comes to some of these details, but there are lots of cases that I know of, and other people who are in gun culture as a whole, that we know of, where people were joking around with firearms and frankly not treating them as if they were loaded, treating them as if they're unloaded, and being rather jocular in their use of them, and people died as a result. I'll just leave it in very general terms that way. There are many places that you can go online that would give you very specific instances, along with security cam footage and things like that, of what happens when people don't take this seriously, and I'll just leave it there for now. But yeah, that is the first rule. Never, ever, ever, ever assume that a gun is unloaded. No, instead, the mnemonic is loaded fingers point at backstops. We always assume that it's loaded. Okay, first rule. Always assume that it's loaded. Unless you've actually checked and cleared it for yourself, you don't know. Treat it as if it's a live gun. Treat it as if it is what we call hot, or live, or ready to go, or chambered. Those are all terms that could be used to signify a gun that has a live round in the chamber. Okay. And that is another thing that we'll need to discuss when we get to that point. But a gun being unloaded doesn't mean that the magazine is out. It means that the chamber is empty and the magazine is out. We'll get to that later. But for now, you always assume that it's loaded. So loaded fingers point at backstops. Okay, what does the finger part have to do with it? Well, the finger part of it has to do with a nasty habit that a lot of people have of putting their trigger finger inside the trigger guard and even resting on the trigger itself. That is an absolutely atrocious habit. And again, it's a habit that has more than once gotten somebody killed. And it is a very hard habit to break at the same time, because a lot of people are, they watch movies, and in a lot of movies, there are some movies that are better about this than others, but there's a lot of, especially the older action movies, where, guys, big Rambo types were carrying around guns all the time, and the whole time that they were carrying the gun around, they had their trigger finger inside the trigger guard, right on the trigger a lot of times, and that is just simply not safe. That, out of actually all of the rules that we're going to discuss here, that one alone is the one that will get noticed the most quickly. I can guarantee it, if you're with a group of people that take safety seriously. Because a firearm that is in proper working order is not going to go off by itself. The only way it's going to go off is if somebody pulls the trigger. And the best way to avoid pulling the trigger is to not have your finger anywhere near the trigger if you're not actually actively shooting the gun. For practical purposes at the range, if you're not actually at the firing line with the muzzle pointed at downrange, that is the business end of the gun pointed downrange at the target area, there is absolutely no reason for your finger to be on the trigger. So the standard procedure is like this. My finger is up on the frame of the gun. It is not on the trigger guard at all. It is definitely not on the trigger. If I'm carrying a gun around, I'm going to be carrying it with my finger up on the frame. Like I said, this is easily the rule that will get noticed the most easily and first, and for good reason. Practically speaking, this is the habit that saves the most lives when it comes to basic gun handling. Okay, always making sure that your trigger finger is nowhere near the trigger. It's not on the trigger guard. It's definitely not on the trigger. No, it is up on the actual frame of the gun. So this is how it would look with a fairly typical semi-auto handgun. Let's also go ahead and show you what it would look like with a rifle. Okay, again, you see that my finger is all the way up here. It is not resting on any part of the trigger guard and definitely not on the trigger. Okay, if I'm going to hold and handle a gun, my trigger finger needs to be straight and it needs to be up on the frame somewhere. Okay. With some guns, admittedly, that is really uncomfortable because some guns are very wide, right above the trigger guard area, and so your finger's really kind of craning all the way out there, and it's really super uncomfortable. But being uncomfortable is a whole lot better than being responsible for somebody else's death. Okay, I know it can be annoying, I know it can even be painful with some guns, but you need to make sure that that is what you're doing. And my general policy when I'm out there and anyone's using my stuff is basically when it comes to significant issues, especially while the gun is loaded and actively being fired, if you mess up when the gun is actually hot, that's pretty much the end for you. You're not going to be using my stuff anymore, and if it's severe enough, we're going to go ahead and pack up and go home, possibly because we have to deal with somebody who's bleeding. If it is a case of mishandling a gun that is empty, checked and cleared empty, we all know that it's empty. I'm usually a little bit more lenient with people. New people I often keep a pretty good eye on, and them I'll give them 2 or 3 warnings, but after the third warning, well actually at the third warning I should say, you do this 3 times and you're done. You're not going to be using my equipment and you're not going to be shooting with me. You're going to go sit off to the side and that's going to be the end of it, and I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're 50 years older than me. I don't care if you're an 8-year-old. If you mess up, even at a very basic level, a level that's not really going to affect anything in and of itself because, the gun's empty or whatever, in disregard for any of these rules that I'm talking about, by the 3rd strike, you're not shooting with me anymore. That's the end of it. So don't test me on that because I will enforce that. And I have absolutely no problem enforcing that. You need to get it through your head that these rules are habits. And habits are what determine whether or not you are safe. If you have safe habits, you will always default to the safe side and nothing's going to happen. If you have bad habits though, then the potential, not that it always does happen, but the potential for something bad happening will be there. And that makes you a very, very dangerous person to be around. And like I said, if it happens with a live gun, that's the end of that completely. Like I said, if we're dealing with an unloaded gun, and we'll get to this more when we talk about procedures because we have usually unloaded guns in one area and then loaded guns in another area. If it happens in the area where all the unloaded guns are, like I said, I'll be a little bit more tolerant, especially with people who are brand new and people who are a little bit younger. But like I said, my max is 3 on that side of things. Okay, you have to get these habits down. That's what these rules really are. They're habits. When you pick up a gun, it needs to be your habit that your trigger finger automatically goes up on the frame. Okay, and to a certain extent that does take practice. Hey, every time a gun is handed to you, this should be what you're looking for. Okay, where does my trigger finger need to be? Up on the frame, up on the frame, up on the frame. As soon as I put that in my hand, I need to make sure that my trigger finger is in the right spot. Okay, so that's the second rule. So going back to the mnemonic here, we have loaded fingers point at backstops. So we already discussed the first rule, the loaded part. We'll always treat the gun as if it's loaded. Then the finger part, loaded fingers. Those fingers need to be straight and up on the frame of the gun. So loaded fingers point at. And the mnemonic, I know it's 2 words instead of 1, which would be more helpful, but just work with me. Okay, point at. What part of the 4 universal rules does this talk about? It talks about the very simple fact that you are only going to hit something that you point at. And what that means is that you don't want to point at things that you don't want to hit. Okay, and so when you're out at the range, a lot of times you'll see people doing really funny things with their guns, holding them in very unnatural ways because they're trying to make sure that whatever the gun is pointing at is something that is safe. So you will see people who are walking around with the gun pointed up in the air because there are people around them and they don't want to point the gun at any of them. That's a really, really, really terrible habit to have, to point a gun at another living person. Absolutely atrocious habits. And like I said, that is going to get you kicked out of any respectable range day whatsoever. Don't do that. That is sometimes referred to as muzzling people or flagging people or sweeping people. It goes by a few different terms, but the basic idea is the same. This muzzle end, the business end of the gun, should never, ever, 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 especially in the context of a range day, should never, ever be pointed at another living person. And in addition, it's also a good idea to consider other valuable things around. Okay, be really bad to point it at another human being. It is also not nearly as bad, but still a problem if you go around pointing your weapon at, say, your nice car or your nice table or whatever nice thing you would probably like to have back at the end of the day without bullet holes in it. So you need to be cognizant and aware of what is around you. And the worst culprit when it comes to muzzle awareness, pointing at the right thing, is usually handguns. And the reason for that is that handguns are relatively short and they're light, and there's unfortunately a lot of people that talk with their hands and the gun is going every which way and it winds up pointing every which way. And yeah, if for some reason somebody forgets one of the safety rules, like not putting your trigger finger on the trigger when you're not actually at the firing line using the gun, if somebody forgets something like that and they're pointing the gun every which way, there's a possibility, a very real possibility, that they could send off a round, squeeze the trigger, send off a round, and it wind up going into someone or something that it shouldn't have. Okay, so when showing me to have a straight trigger finger. So when you are dealing with a gun, you need to be hyper aware of what the muzzle end of that gun is doing. You need to be very sure that what you're pointing at is deliberate. For people who are new, it doesn't hurt at all to pick a safe object, as it were. It might be a rock that's on the ground, or a clump of dirt or a piece of grass, whatever. Something that is safe, in a generally safe direction, there are not people in that direction, and constantly point the firearm at that while you're doing this, that, and the other thing. Be very aware that the firearm basically stays in the same place while you're doing anything else. That also is something that can be very hard to develop as a habit. The habit of keeping the gun relatively stable in one given safe direction, or pointed at a rock or whatever it is while you're doing everything else. It is very unnatural for human beings to do that. It's necessary. That's the safe habit. Pick something safe and keep the gun pointed at that while you do whatever else you're doing. Okay, that's the habit that you need to develop, but it is a very difficult habit. Like I said, because we talk with our hands and those kinds of things, and we're used to our hands basically going with our head, whatever we're looking at. But when you're dealing with a firearm, you need to make absolutely sure that the muzzle end, that the business end of the gun is only pointing at something that is safe. And if you're someone who is prone to talking with your hands, the first thing you're going to want to do before you start talking is to set the gun down. Pointed in a safe place, of course. Okay, if you're someone who has the habits of, turning your head this way and that and being kind of fidgety and having your hands go all over, set the gun down before you do anything else. Because if that gun points at anything that is valuable, definitely human beings, but that also can include physical things that we still want to have at the end of the day, like cars and things like that. It's not good when the car has a bullet hole in it, especially in the engine block. If you're pointing the gun at things you shouldn't be pointing at, yeah, that is definitely a major safety violation and a terrible habit to be in. When you have a gun in your hands, you need to be locked in. You need to be very aware of what the business end of that gun is doing. All right, so we've gotten through 3 of the rules. Go back to the mnemonic here for a second. Loaded fingers, point at backstops. Well, we've already talked about what it means when we say loaded, what that's supposed to remind us of. Always treat a gun as if it's loaded. If you haven't checked and cleared it yourself, you don't know, assume that it has a round in the chamber. So loaded fingers need to be straight. Straight, straight, straight. Okay, no booger hooks, straight. Okay, straight and on the frame of the gun. Up on the frame, not on the trigger guard, not in the trigger, of course not touching the trigger, straight and up on the frame. And then we talked about the point at part. Be intentional about what you're pointing at and make sure that what you're pointing at is something that is safe, something that if the gun does happen to go off for whatever reason, usually because you pulled the trigger when you weren't supposed to, if the gun goes off, you're going to destroy a rock, a clump of dirt, a piece of grass, something that's not overly important. Okay, and then that final part of the mnemonic, loaded fingers point at backstops, that is the fourth universal rule of firearm safety. You always want to make sure that your backstop is a safe backstop. That is when you shoot, there are going to be one of two basic outcomes. Either you're going to hit what you're aiming at, or you're going to miss. And if you hit what you're aiming at, there's a really good chance that the bullet is going to go through it, very oftentimes. Whether that be, an animal that you might be hunting, or if it might be a paper target, or various and sundry other things that are out there, there's a really good chance that your bullet is going to go right through whatever your target is, especially if it's just a target day and that's all you're doing is paper targets. Your bullets very oftentimes is going to go through the target, and you need to think about what is behind that target. Okay, and this kind of goes back to where we were talking about the point at part. Always make sure that your gun is pointed in a safe direction. Well, if you decide that you want to point at, that shrub that's off in the distance, you need to also ask yourself, what's behind that shrub? Okay, if the gun goes off, if I do something that I'm not supposed to and the gun goes off and I'm shooting at that shrub, that's where my gun is pointed, do I actually know enough about what is in, around, and behind that shrub to know that that's actually truly safe? Okay, is it that case that maybe that shrub might be concealing, and stuff like this actually does happen. Sometimes a person can be, out in the field somewhere. This is usually not an issue for indoor ranges, of course, although weird things can happen there too. But outdoor ranges, this kind of stuff is actually fairly common, and that somebody will be sitting down off in the distance out in the sagebrush somewhere, or out in the trees somewhere, and by just looking around, you're not necessarily going to see them. And so you don't know if those things that you think are safe, those trees out there, that sagebrush that's out there, those bushes that are out there, until you actually walk out there and check and see what's going on around you, you don't actually know if that's safe or not. Okay, and this is one of the most important things about picking a spot to shoot when you're on public land, especially. At indoor ranges, a lot of that stuff is kind of handled for you, but you still need to give due consideration to it. But outside on public land, it's that much more important because it's public land. Other people have the right to be out there, and before you start shooting in their direction, you need to make sure they're not there. So like I said, yes, pick a bush or something off in the distance to point the gun at, that's fine, but make sure that the area is clear of things that you don't want to hit, and also make sure that what is around it is going to be safe to shoot at. For example, I mentioned earlier pointing at a rock. And one of the problems with rocks is that rocks can produce ricochets, meaning that the bullet can come back at you. Now, close up, that's where ricochets happen. Now, if you're pointing at a rock that's, 100 yards away, the chance of getting a ricochet from that is pretty much non-existent. But if you're pointing at a rock that is right at your feet, and you actually do have a gun that goes off and hits that rock, there's a really good chance that that bullet could wind up coming back at you because it bounces off that rock. So what is safe, also to a certain safe to point at, what the backstop is, what is around the targets and beyond the targets, that to a certain extent will change with distance. The further out from you it is, typically the less danger to you it is. So if you want to point at a rock, the rock that's at 100 yards is fine, the rock that's right next to your feet is not fine. If it's up close that you pick to be your safety spot to point at, regular dirt is a lot better idea. Okay, so give consideration to how these things that are around what you're shooting at are going to behave. Are they really hard and such that they can ricochet? Is it soft and therefore going to be a little bit more absorbent? Is there a possibility that somebody is out there that you haven't seen yet, and you want to make sure that you're not going to accidentally hit them? So when you set up your targets, check what is behind your target, and sometimes it will go on for several hundred yards that is kind of just flat land out there, and you need to make sure that it is all clear. And the other major consideration for a backstop, of course, is that you won't always hit your target. In fact, a lot of times you won't. Like I said, if you do hit your target, a lot of targets you'll wind up going through, and you need to know what's behind the target for that. But especially if you're new, there's also going to be a really good chance that you won't hit the target sometimes. In fact, maybe a lot of times, depending on your particular proclivities and the particular gun that you're trying to use. And the next question is, what happens if you miss? Okay, if I hit this target, where's the bullet going to go afterwards? Or if I miss the target completely, where are all the places that the bullet could go? And when it comes to that level of practicality, one of the things that you always want to have behind your target zone is something that rises up that can catch stray bullets to go every which way. And so when we go shooting, we actually shoot at a place that has a hill most of the time. And what we do is we shoot at the base of the hill, so that if we happen to be a little high or a little off to one side or the other, all the stray bullets are going to go into the hillside and be stopped by the hill, and therefore rendered neutral, rendered safe, because it's all stopped there and we don't have to worry about stray bullets going every which way. Unfortunately, I have seen some people who have gone out to that same hill that I shoot at, and they've actually put their targets on the top of the hill. And they do that because the top of the hill is, of course, further away from you than the bottom is, and they want to make sure that their shots are accurate for long distance, so that's their way of getting to long distance shots. The problem, though, is that if all your targets are at the top of that ridge, well, if you hit your target, you're going to go through it and then over the back side of that hill, and who knows who is there or isn't there. Or even if you don't hit the target, because there's always a chance that you can miss, you wind up sending around off into the wild blue yonder, and who knows where that will come down and who that will land on, etc. So you need to make sure that your backstop is safe in terms of there not being any people down there or anything valuable down there. But you also need to make sure that it's actually going to stop. That's why it's called a backstop. It has to be capable of actually stopping the bullet. If it can't do that, you shouldn't be shooting in that direction. All right, so that's the 4 basic safety rules. And we'll go ahead and we'll use the mnemonic again. Loaded fingers point at backstops. What does the loaded remind us of? It reminds us that we are supposed to treat every gun as if it is loaded. If we haven't checked and cleared it ourselves, we need to treat the gun as if it's loaded. Loaded fingers. What does the finger refer to? It refers to the fact that you need to keep your trigger finger straight and completely off of the trigger. Okay. So loaded fingers point at. What is the point at supposed to tell us? It's supposed to tell us that we're supposed to be very intentional about where the muzzle end of the gun is. It needs to be pointed in a safe direction. Not at anyone, certainly. Don't do that at all. And it's also a really good idea to make sure that you're not pointing at any object that would be particularly valuable as well. Okay, so loaded fingers point at, and then backstops. What does the backstop remind us of? It says that what we need to do when we're shooting at something is we need to consider what is going to happen if the bullet goes through that something that we're shooting at, and what happens if we happen to miss around that target. Whatever is out there needs to be safe, and it also needs to be such that it will actually stop the bullet there and keep it from going into places where we can't see what's going on and potentially become a problem for somebody else. Okay. So there's the mnemonic. Those are the 4 basic rules. Loaded fingers point at backstops. Loaded, always treat it as if it's loaded. Loaded fingers, always keep your fingers straight and off of the trigger. It needs to be up on the frame. Point at, make sure that you're pointing in a safe direction at all times. And then backstops, make sure that you are aware of what is behind your target, what is around the target, and also make sure that that is capable of stopping the bullets. All right. Those are the 4 basic rules. When we get out there at range day, what I will generally do is I will ask the people, especially the younger people, to go through those rules. And I'll usually go through the mnemonic, and I'll say, okay, here's the mnemonic, loaded fingers point at backstops. What does the loaded mean? What's that rule? Loaded fingers, what does the finger tell us that we're supposed to do with our finger? Loaded fingers point at. What are we supposed to point at? Something that's safe. And then backstops. What's the deal with a backstop? What is a backstop? A backstop is something that is safe to shoot at and something that will stop the bullets. Okay, that's what you need to be capable of telling me for me to be confident that you actually understand what the basic rules of safety are. All right, so that's the 4 universal rules of gun safety. Now let's talk about some practical range etiquette. When we go out shooting, my relatively small group and I, when we go out shooting, our basic policy is that the only place for loaded guns, there is an exception to this, but by and large, the only place for loaded guns is at what we call the firing line, the line that no shooter passes. That's why it's called a line, and we're firing from that line. So the firing line, the line that you never get in front of. If you're at that line, you can have a loaded gun as long as your muzzle is pointed downrange. But anything behind that, you have to be unloaded. Okay, so that is a basic safety rule that we have. It's not one of the 4 universal rules, not one of the 4 universal habits, but it is a good practical rule that prevents a lot of problems. So what will happen when you come out with this, a lot of times you will be given the gun that you are to shoot, and you'll also be given the magazine, and that's what these are called. These are called magazines. There is another thing that some people sometimes confuse magazines with that are called clips, and the easy way to tell the difference is that clips only hold on to part of the cartridge. They don't completely enclose it, whereas magazines, if you keep putting rounds into them, they eventually fill the bottom part, and those rounds are basically enclosed. Clips, on the other hand, basically just hold on to one part of the cartridge, usually the back end of the cartridge. Magazines, they cover the whole thing. But what will happen once you get out there is you'll be given the gun in one hand and the magazine in the other. And you will walk up to the firing line, making sure that your trigger finger is off of the trigger, that the muzzle is pointed in a safe direction. Okay, if you haven't checked and cleared the gun yet, you need to check and clear the gun to make sure that what was handed to you was safe. That's actually the first thing you should do. Check and clear it first. Then make sure your trigger finger is straight and up on the frame. Make sure you're pointing the muzzle in a safe direction. If you're not sure, straight up in the sky is not a bad place to go. Generally speaking. Now, if you're in a building and you have stories above you, obviously that wouldn't be great, but if we're outside, there's usually not anything above, and that's okay. Make sure the muzzle is pointed in a safe direction, and then, of course, make sure that you know what you're shooting at, what's around it. Is it going to be able to stop the bullets? But it's only when you actually get to the firing line that you can load the gun. Okay, so once you're actually walked to the firing line, you'll go ahead and insert that magazine into the gun, and you will charge it, and then with the gun pointed in the right direction, then you can go ahead and start shooting. All right. So that is a basic safety procedure that we have that, like I said, eliminates a lot of problems. So gun in one hand, magazine in the other. Don't bring the two together until you're actually at the firing line. Now, sometimes at the firing line we'll have different lanes set up so that, say one person can be shooting a pistol at the same time that somebody else is shooting a rifle. That will kind of depend on how many people we have there who really know the safety routine and things like that we can have monitor each station. If we only have one person that can monitor, then we usually only have one station set up. But those, however many stations it is, will be along a given line that you don't go past, and at least not once the range is hot, and we'll talk about that in a second. But like I said, the basic idea is that the gun stays completely unloaded until we're actually right there at that line. Now, like I said, there is an exception for that, and that is people's personal carry gun. We live in Idaho, and Idaho is, of course, a constitutional carry state, and because of that, there are a lot of people that prefer to carry on their person a loaded firearm. And we do allow people to have those loaded firearms back behind the firing line as long as that firearm is properly secured. If it is a handgun, it needs to be in an appropriate holster. And the basic requirements for an appropriate holster are as follows. One, it needs to be rigid so that it doesn't collapse on itself. Okay, so rigid holster, not going to collapse. It also needs to be one that is such that it retains the firearm so that if you take a tumble or a spill, it's not going to fall out. So it needs to basically be shake-proof. And then the third part of your proper holster is that it needs to completely cover the trigger area. So no matter how I poke it and try to get into it, I can't actually get to the trigger while the gun is in the holster. So if the handgun is properly holstered, then we say it's fine if it's loaded as long as it stays in that condition. If you want to bring your personal carry gun out of the holster, you need to be doing that at the firing line. Okay, this is basically the sole exception. If you're exercising your constitutional right to carry, perfectly fine, but as a matter of safety and security for everybody there, it needs to be in a proper holster. Okay, properly secured. And like I said, it doesn't get brought out of that proper holster until you're actually at the firing line. Okay, so like I said, that is the one exception, but it is that way. There are also people who prefer as their carry, which would not be a concealed carry, but there are some people that do prefer to carry a rifle. And most of the time on range days, that's not really all that practical, so we would really suggest that you rethink that. But there are perhaps a few people that might be rather adamant about it. With rifles, we of course would require that the safety be on the rifle and that it would be slung. So you have your sling on it, it goes around you, and it hangs off of you. You don't touch it. Okay, if you want to carry a loaded rifle, that's behind the firing line, that's the way that it needs to be. So safety on, slung, no touch. All right, those are, like I said, the exceptions, but for most people that's not really going to be a thing, especially with rifles. People using a rifle as their preferred carry gun is relatively rare. And if they want to carry a loaded handgun, fine, as long as it stays in the holster. Only time that you take it out of the holster is at the firing line. All right, and then our next few range procedures that are good to know is the basic field commands. The two basic commands that let you know what the status of the range is range hot and range cold. So if somebody yells out range hot, that doesn't mean that people are going to start shooting right away. It's not a command to fire, but it is a command to tell you that going down range is not safe right now because somebody could start firing. Okay, what it means is that it is okay to start firing. It doesn't tell you that you have to fire, but it says it's okay to fire. So if somebody yells out range hot, and they will at the beginning of the shooting session, that means that all of the targets have been placed out there, all of the people have been brought in. We've already gone ahead and checked and make sure that there is nobody out there that could, be endangered if we start shooting over there. Once everything has been set up and checked and cleared, then we will, and we've had our little brief safety talk, then we'll go ahead and yell range hot to let anyone know that we're going to start shooting and that you can't go past the firing line once that command is given. The other basic command is range cold. And what range cold is basically a request to stop firing, meaning that we want to take a break for snacks or something like that. It can be as mundane as that, or you got up there and you intended to start shooting, but something isn't working with the gun for whatever reason, and you say, I want to figure this out, and I'm not really comfortable with shooting right now. Let's go ahead and call it off. And so you call range cold, and somebody comes over and helps you. Now, like I said, that is a request to stop shooting. To command people to stop shooting, that command is cease fire. Okay, so Range hot and range cold are informative. That is, we intend to start shooting now. We intend to stop shooting now. But ceasefire is a command, and that is a command that needs to be obeyed without question. What that means is that there is an immediate danger, and that if people continue shooting, there is a high probability that somebody will be injured or die. Okay, that is not a request, that is a command. Everything needs to stop right now. And if you hear that command, you need to immediately stop whatever you're doing. You need to stop shooting, and you need to immediately clear the weapon. Okay, so we talked about the 4 universal rules. We've talked about some basic range procedures. That is, we don't have any loaded guns behind the firing line. You'll only load them once you get to the firing line. What will usually happen is we'll hand you the gun. You'll go ahead and check and clear it, and then after you've checked and cleared it, we'll also hand you the magazine. You keep them separate until you get to the firing line, and with the barrel pointed downrange in a safe direction at a place that will be able to stop the bullet, that is the point where the magazine goes into the gun. And if you decide that you're done firing, you don't want to fire all the bullets, whatever, that's fine. But before you leave the firing position, you need to check and clear the weapon. That is, basically unload it, so that you don't bring the loaded weapon back into kind of the safe zone, as it were. Okay. Basic range procedure, and then, like I said, the basic range commands, 2 of them are technically informative kind of requests. There's only one that's actually a hard command. The 2 informational statements are range hot and range cold. Range hot says we're getting ready to shoot here. And then range cold is a request, can we please stop now? Can we stop shooting here? And then the command, when there is a significant danger, is ceasefire. And frankly, anybody at the range can yell ceasefire. That's not just for the range officers. That's not whoever happens to be acting as the range officer at that given moment. I'm usually one of them because it's usually my guns that are being used. But anyone can yell ceasefire. Anyone, who is able to voice that command. And like I said, no matter who gives it, it doesn't matter if it is a 2-year-old or a 102-year-old, you need to immediately stop, lower the weapon, or raise it to some points where it's not possibly going to hit anything. Clear that weapon, make sure that it's completely empty, await further instruction. Okay, so like I said, that one is the command. Range hot and range cold are informative. They're saying, okay, we intend to start shooting now, we intend to stop now, but ceasefire is the command. You have to obey it right then. If you do not obey that one right then, the very first time that it is given, that to me is the same as the whole 3 strikes you're out thing. The 3 strikes is for the 4 universal safety rules behind the firing line with empty guns. But if you have a live gun, and somebody yells ceasefire, I don't care who it is, and you don't cease fire, that will be the last time you shoot any of my guns. I can guarantee it, at least that day. We might revisit it on a different day once you've had a chance to really reconsider that choice. But then and there in that moment, you are going to not be shooting with me anymore. Okay, that is one of the most important commands, and it needs to be obeyed without question. And like I said, it doesn't matter who it is. Okay, and that goes to whoever you are that I'm planning on shooting with. If you see something that is unsafe and you yell ceasefire, I will stop. And whoever else is out there shooting should stop immediately, right then and there. Like I said, that is a command that anybody can give, and it's because this is a very serious thing. Firearms can be a whole lot of fun. But if anything seems out of kilter, if anything seems dangerous, anybody should be able to call that out and be able to stop the shooting so that we can get the safety issue taken care of. Okay? Alright, so those are the basic range procedures. The guns behind the firing line are unloaded. You only load them when you actually get to the firing line. That's the basic procedure. The range commands consist of 2 informative statements and one that is actually a hard command. Range hot, we're going to start shooting now. Range cold, we need to stop now. Ceasefire, stop immediately, unload the gun, and await further instruction. Alright, so we've covered the 4 rules of gun safety. Remember, loaded fingers point at backstops. We've covered a lot of the basic range procedures, and then finally a brief overview of the basic controls on a semi-auto. Now, on semi-autos, there are usually 5 major controls that a semi-auto gun can have. Not all of them will have all 5, but there are 5 basic controls. There are also guns out there that will have even more than 5, but for new people, you're not usually going to worry about any of those other controls. Just the main 5 that I want to talk about. All right, let's go ahead and pick an example here. I'm going to practice what I preach by making sure that it is clear first. Of course, it has nothing in the mag well, and I pulled back on the charging handle on the side so that I could look up into the action and make sure that there was no cartridge up there so that I know that it is completely clear. All right, in terms of controls, the 5 basic controls are 1, the trigger. That's usually the control that pretty much everybody understands and they know what that does. So the first is the trigger. The second control is the magazine release. This can look like a lot of different things on a lot of different guns. This gun has a paddle type release to get the magazine out. Go ahead and do an example here. So the magazine is in, I press forward on the magazine release here, and that allows me to take the magazine out. Okay, other guns will have a little button on the side where your trigger finger is that you will push to get the magazine out. So trigger, magazine release. The other major control is usually on the opposite side of whatever the magazine release is, and that is the safety. This one has a simple rotating safety. When I push my thumb down, on most guns, there are a few exceptions to this, but on most guns the safety is in a place that if you push your thumb down, that means you're ready to fire. If you pull it up, then it's safe. It should be noted, of course, that this is a mechanical safety, and mechanical items can always fail, so you never want to rely on it. You don't ever want to say, well, the gun has its safety on, therefore nothing could possibly happen. No. Okay, just having the safety on doesn't make the gun safe. Not in a guaranteed sense. You handling it correctly, you being of good habit when you're holding the gun, that's what makes it safe. Like I said, those 4 universal rules that I talked about earlier, those are habits. You need to maintain those habits regardless of whether the gun safety is on or not. Okay, it's a mechanical device. Mechanical devices can fail. You never want to rely on that. But a lot of times we will hand people guns with the safety on just as an added measure. We don't ever rely on it, but we still use it because it's a good habit. Okay. And so with most guns, pushing your thumb down takes off the safety, pushing the thumb back up puts it back on safety with most guns. All right, after that, the next control that this gun actually doesn't have, so I'm going to set it down for the moment and go to a gun that does have the other control. Like I said, not all guns, all semi-autos will have all 5 controls. But the next one that I want to talk about is on rifles, it's usually called the bolt stop. On handguns, it's usually called the slide stop. And that is usually a little lever that locks back the slide or holds back the bolt for you. So if I want the slide to be held back, there is a little lever right here that you can see is kind of at a little bit of an angle relative to the slide. That lever is holding the slide back. So to disengage it, I just push down on it and the slide goes forward. And on a gun that has this feature, after you're done firing, the gun will automatically lock back like it is here. And so most of the time, you just use that button to release the bolt or the slide. Although if I want to manually hold the bolt open, I just push on the bottom of that lever. So I'm using my thumb to push up on that lever and pull back, and as long as I'm pushing up on that lever, it will hold it back. And then once I have released the slide, then I can take my finger off of the slide stop or bolt release, or there's a few different things that it can get called, but it's basically the mechanism that holds the bolt back. And it's usually the same mechanism that if you push it basically the other way, it will release the slide or it will release the bolt. And then the last control Last but certainly not least is the charging handle or slide. On a handgun, it's called the slide, and you actually just directly grab the slide and pull it back to manually cycle the action. On handguns, everything tends to be fairly trim, and so the best you get is basically some slide serrations that allow you to grip it and manipulate it. But on rifles, they actually usually give you a proper control surface, and so we'll look at that. This one actually has two. There is a charging handle that is underneath the optic here, and I can use that to manually cycle the weapon. And this one also has a proper charging handle, side charging handle as well, and I can just grab that, pull back, and that will cycle the action manually as well. Okay. Those are the 5 basic controls: trigger, magazine release, then of course the safety, the bolt stop or slide stop, and then the charging handle or slide. We'll discuss more of that when we get out there, because every gun's a little bit different, and so that just kind of has to be dealt with that way. Go ahead and show basic loading procedure next. Very simple, but not everybody knows this, so it does need to be discussed. If you have an empty magazine and you have a round, this is not a live round, by the way, this is just a snap cap, it's a safety round. Most of the safety rounds are either red in color or orange in color. There are a few out there that are blue, but usually red or orange, and pretty much every other color is a live round. Treat them accordingly. But to load the magazine, you usually push from the front of the magazine, has kind of an open spot on it, and then middle towards the rear. So you are going to push down so that you get under the little feed lips here. Then once you're under the feed lips, then you just push it back, and you keep doing that for successive rounds. So that's how you load the magazine. And then with the firearm, in order to load it, you're going to start by putting the magazine into the gun. This is when you're at the firing line. Put the magazine in the gun, and then you operate either the charging handle or the slide, and you just let it fly forward. Okay, you don't have to maintain hand pressure, just pull it back and then let it go, and then the gun will be loaded. To unload it, you do basically the same thing in the same order. That is, you're going to deal with the magazine in the gun first, and then operating the charging system. So this one has its magazine release button here at the side, so I'm going to use my thumb to push that. That pops out the magazine, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull back on the slide until the round comes out. And that is how you check and clear it. When you're done checking and clearing a gun, the mag well should be completely empty, and then the chamber should be such that you can't see anything in there, you can't feel anything in there. Do make sure that the gun is properly locked open before you go sticking fingers and stuff like that in there. Usually just a visual inspection of the chamber is perfectly sufficient. To be a little extra safe, I put my finger in there just to make sure that it's not a dark colored round, because there are some rounds that do have dark colors. There are some of them that are black, some of them that are kind of a gray color that are a little hard to see, and so basically checking to make sure that it's empty is a good practice. But we'll discuss more of that once we get out there, because like I said, every gun is a little bit different. This is just kind of a basic what to expect kind of thing. All right, that covers it. I know that was kind of long, but us going over it here and now this way makes it so that we don't have to do all of this when we get out there on range day. So on range day, I expect everybody to be able to repeat those 4 universal gun rules that I gave you, and when I ask you to do it, I'm going to be using the mnemonic just to keep myself straight and make sure that we don't repeat anything. So I will say, okay, loaded fingers point at backstops. What does loaded mean? What does the fingers mean? What does the point at mean? What does the backstop mean? And you will need to give me the correct answers for that. And then I want you to understand the basic procedures that we have for operating the range. That is, basically every gun that is behind the firing line needs to be empty. Okay, you do not load the gun until you actually get to the firing line, and before you leave the firing line, you need to make sure that it is checked and cleared. And then our range commands, we have 2 that are basically informational, range hot, range cold. We intend to start shooting, we intend to stop. 1 actual command that can be given by anybody and needs to be immediately obeyed, cease fire. And then you need to be aware of the basic controls, I've already talked about it, the trigger, the magazine release, the safety, the slide stop or bolt stop, and then of course the slide or charging handle. And then, like I said, the exact procedures on loading and unloading, we'll cover that a little bit more detail once we get out there because it varies from gun to gun a little bit. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention and giving me a hearing on this. I very much so appreciate it. I appreciate it when people take this kind of thing seriously. And pretty much all the people that I have go shooting with me are usually Christians or at least associated with other Christians. And part of our belief system, it will vary from denomination and even from group to group and person to person a little bit. But in general, Christians have a very high value for human life. And that's why these kinds of safety briefings and things like that are very important to us, is we do think very highly of God's gift of life to us, and we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence in preserving that life and making sure that we are actually loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, and we are loving God by behaving appropriately with His creation. All right. Thank you for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior and Master of Masters. Amen.